And we are live. April Fool's Day in the great United States of America, 2021. Ryan Ray alongside the one and only Mr. Chris Fenton. How are you doing today, sir?
Yeah, I was thinking of coming up with an April Fool's joke and revealing the fact that I have a mask on and I'm actually Xi Jinping's PLA leading cousin that is actually working as a shill here in Manhattan Beach, California for the Chinese Communist Party, but I thought it would have been in bad taste.
Well, listen, I'm a capitalist, so I have a price to be a shield. There is a price tag for me to be a shield. So let's just say that right now. So if Xi Jinping wants to pay me, everyone has a price, and so we can talk about that offline. It's dollars, not digital yuan, though. That is a stipulation. Mr. Fenton, it seems like you are making waves everywhere. Obviously, you released an important op-ed earlier this week in the American Conservative, I believe, and you've been on a handful of podcasts, lectures. Are you a full-time member of the traveling or speaking circuit now? Is that your new role?
Yeah, I don't know if that's the case. I mean, what's interesting is that op-ed was written actually for more of a left-leaning publication, and I think they felt like maybe it was a little too hawkish. So we went with American Thinker, and I was concerned whether it was going to get a lot of play, and my concerns were put at bay because I have been in a lot of spots. I mean, even today, I'm on the Foreign Desk podcast. This afternoon, I'm doing the Cornell Review live podcast. This afternoon, I'm doing a lecturing at USC Marshall School tomorrow, doing News Nation tomorrow night. It's been pretty awesome just in regards to getting the word out about the issues that we have with China, trying to be constructive and coming up with potential solutions, just ideas, throwing out ideas. I am surely not the expert that has all the solutions, or maybe none of them, but at least I'm trying to get the word out there that we need to talk about how we're going to engage with China moving forward in a better, more constructive and healthier way for America and our allies. That's just the bottom line. And I'm glad the platforms are out there to talk about it.
What's that line from the, I think it's The Office, where someone says something, he goes, that's good. Let's get all the bad ideas out first. If nothing else, our podcast is doing that. We're getting all the bad ideas out first. I don't think that's true, but if nothing else, we can serve as that.
Well, it's funny. I think I brought it up once before, but the Mossad, there's a legend that the Mossad has 11 members that discuss solutions to a particular problem or a strategy towards a particular challenge. And what they do is they gauge where everybody wants to do something. And typically 10 out of the 11 believe that one direction is to go. So what does the Mossad do? They always go with the direction that the one single outlier decided to do in order to keep their enemy or their challenge off guard. So anyway, maybe I'm that single one that has the terrible ideas, but we're just going to run with them anyway.
Okay, well, speaking of that, we won't spend a lot of time on this, but it did pop up today from Naval News, and it's an interesting headline. It says that China's new super submarine dwarfs the Typhoon class, which is the Russian submarine. And so for decades, the Russians' Navy mighty PR-941 Typhoon class was the largest. Now the Chinese have overtaken that. And so they go on to talk about the size and the dimensions and how many torpedoes it can hold. And that's all interesting. It can fit through the Suez Canal. They point that out as well. It's not too big for the Suez Canal. Headlines like these, I don't really know how to read them. Are you genuinely concerned about a submarine threat from the Chinese, or is this something kind of a new cool kind of story to watch and to follow along?
Look, I would say there's a handful of cases where bigger is better in life. I know from my wife, she typically likes things in small blue boxes. I would say that a bigger submarine doesn't necessarily mean a better submarine. It does mean that they have submarines and they're probably putting some relatively destructive weapons on those, and they want to show a display of force. But I also always think about the way China considers propaganda in such a powerful way. And I would say there's probably a lot of symbolism in the fact that they built these really large submarines versus some sort of real biting action that they intend to take with them.
Right. Yeah, for perspective, you are right. It says the Ohio class, which is obviously a U.S. sub, carries 24 ballistic missiles. The Chinese can carry, guess how many? Twice as many to the number, 48. And so there's at least a symbolism that at least we can carry twice as many missiles as you guys can. And so I think that's far more what is going on, what is going on here than anything else. But it was interesting. And, I think this is kind of, it's always hard to watch, to follow this news, because you can get really scared. Oh my gosh, they got big subs, they got big missiles. What are they going to do with this? Or you can kind of say, well, okay, that's par for the course. That's what superpowers create weapons.
Okay. I like Basperian's comment there. In fact, speaking for Cornell, I keep saying "Go Big Red," and then I have to put in parentheses. I mean the Cornell Big Red, not China. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, and and please let the comments fly.
Yeah. While I'm at it, we are live on Periscope today, which is where that comment came from. We were told it was shut down yesterday. It didn't shut down. We have talked to our streaming provider, and they have assured us that as soon as Periscope is closed, we will be on Twitter. But if for some reason that doesn't come to fruition, you can always get the podcast, iTunes, Spotify. Just type in Feeding the Dragon, and you can find the podcast on whatever platform you would like. And while you're there, if you could, Mr. Samuels, give us a 5-star review. We would really appreciate it, and talk about just how smart this show is. That's Ben Samuels right there. So,
well, and by the way, one thing I wanted to bring up, just in regards to Feeding the Dragon and that theme, is somebody dug up a speech I gave at Stanford Business School at their China 2.0 conference back in 2012, and I watched it last night, and it was one of those like cringeworthy moments where you're like, holy cow. I can't believe how misguided I was back in the day. And by the way, I'm fully cognizant of how complicit I was in a lot of these problems, and I'm very open about that. But it was interesting to listen to me define. And by the way, I was there in front of a couple government officials from China too, so I had to be really careful about what I was saying. But I was explaining why China needed us to put real China influence into a movie. And the movie I was talking about was this movie Looper, how we need to put China into the plot, how we needed to have Chinese characters, how we needed to have Chinese influence in the production, in the locations, in the investment of the movie, in the marketing, distribution, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that I talked about was how Hollywood was dominating that market. In fact, I gave one line where literally we were 98 cents of every dollar during a certain period of 2012 that we were reaping from the box office there. And then cut to 2021 in February of this year, Hollywood didn't even make 2% of the market and box office. So that's how far we've come, not only in regards to the early days of pandering and catering to the CCP message, but also how much they've used us to implement those production processes and those skills exchange and all that kind of stuff to essentially get caught up to speed in the filmmaking process so that they can make movies themselves for their own market and dominate the market over all Hollywood films.
And
by the way, that was my Throwback Thursday, my
Throwback Thursday.
TBT, hashtag, which I learned about from my wife because she's good at those hashtags.
Looper was a fantastic movie. I haven't seen it in years. I need to go back and watch it. Speaking of fantastic movies, Godzilla vs. Kong. I watched it twice already. Once yesterday morning, once last night with my kids. It's fantastic. Absolutely loved it. Thought they crushed it. So kudos to the studio and the director and the actors and actresses.
Kudos to the CCP influenced studio Wanda, which owns Legendary Films. So you enjoyed a version of Chinese propaganda and Chinese influence. Well done.
Let me tell you something. This isn't a major spoiler. Godzilla and Kong fight. You know where they fight at? Hong Kong. They wrecked that place. They wrecked Hong Kong. Like, just demolished it. So
that's a little. Is there symbolism there?
I don't know, because it was interesting because the main battle happens in Hong Kong and they are destroying buildings as two big giants would when they fought. And so I wondered that when it happened, is like, I don't know, because they don't show much of the human atrocity of, but they're skyscrapers just getting all those trailer shots you see of them fighting, that's in Hong Kong. And so I just found that to be fascinating. I didn't know if you
Did
had
they show like any of the monsters actually fall on top of umbrella movement protesters or any sort of pro-democracy push or gatherings? No.
No, none of that. No guys in front of tanks that they're stepping on, nothing like that. But I'm curious. You should, if you have HBO Max. I don't know.
I'm definitely gonna watch it. And by the way, I have good friend. I mean, yes, it's owned by the Chinese, the studio that made it, Legendary. But I have actually good friends who work there, so I of course support them, and I know how difficult their job is trying to both monetize things around the world and deal with the fact that they work for a Chinese company.
So I guess it's okay just to ask you your thoughts on it. No problem with destroying. Is it because it's Hong Kong? Would that be okay? Would it matter if it was in Beijing? Or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's very difficult. In fact, there's WikiLeaks exposed the hack of Sony Studios back in, I think it was 2014, which they blamed on the North Koreans, right? And in that, they actually talk about this movie Pixels, which was a terrible Adam Sandler movie that just didn't turn out the way they wanted it to. But one of the scenes was supposed to be, I think, the destruction of the Great Wall of China. And the Chinese were super upset at that potential scene. So they cut that out of the script before they went to shoot. So yes, there typically is a really adverse reaction to destruction happening in the mainland. It's interesting, though. I mean, I guess one country, two systems works for the movie business and the destruction of Hong Kong.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's see here. Let's move on. Talking about public sentiments statements, you mentioned before we got on that Boeing was bemoaning some of the China talk. What's going on there?
Yeah, I just thought it was a real. I mean, look, here's the bottom line, and you can, there's so many experts talking about this. I mean, Matt Pottinger is one of my favorites that hits on this issue. But when the Chinese government, when the Chinese Communist Party has trouble influencing our main branches of government, whether it's the administration or Congress or even policymakers at the regulatory agencies, they tend to turn their attention to influencing the business community. And I think that's something that we probably are seeing with, not that H&M is American, but like with Nike, H&M, Hugo Boss, Adidas, et cetera, that's their way of influencing the business community to say, hey, you better tell your governments and your journalists and your critics and your people to back off on these sensitive issues. Otherwise, you're going to really pay the price as a business. Boeing had an interesting, I think it was the South China Morning Post, which always is interesting to see what they're putting in print. But Boeing was essentially taking the stand that we need to tone down the rhetoric towards China and the Xinjiang province and other issues, try to separate those issues from the issues of trade. And if we don't, we're going to get caught losing the trade battle. And then Boeing was saying, and if that happens, then we lose all our business in China to Airbus. And then I tweeted that out saying, well, that's depressing because you can tell the CCP probably has the communications director at Boeing, by the nape of the neck, telling them to say something like that. And then my other question is, because I just was in a documentary that was pretty hardcore that was made by France 2 on China's influence around the world. I do wonder whether France would be okay with Airbus just bending over and taking over Boeing's, position in that market and doing everything the CCP tells them to do. I feel like France, yes, we talk about how soft they are or whatever they are, but they also are pretty critical about things happening in China. So I wonder, A, if that's really a case. And B, I've also tweeted out the fact that there's this new China airplane, this commercial jet that's essentially looks like a 737. It looks like a Boeing and an Airbus had sex, and this is the product that happened after birth. That's coming out. And I really wonder whether Boeing or Airbus is really going to get much more traction in that market once that plane comes online and really starts to proliferate throughout the market.
Yeah. So, I mean, why doesn't Boeing do that then? Why don't they just tease it out like they want it teased out? Like if that's what they're calling for, then do it.
What do you mean tease out what?
Well, you're saying that Boeing wants these things to be teased out to separate, the Uyghur issue versus the trade issue. Then why doesn't Boeing lead that charge?
You mean essentially say, hey, look, we make this stance on the Uyghur situation. We don't stand for it, but on business, we love doing business with China.
Do it. I mean, I would applaud that. Do it. They don't want to do it.
They're not going to.
That's my point. They don't really believe it. What they're wanting to do is they're wanting to say, we need to separate these issues, but we're not going to separate them. All they have to do is say, listen, what's happening in the Uyghur, in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs and the cotton and all that stuff, that's terrible. We hate that. And if we find that we're supporting that in any way directly that we can impact, we will. As far as trade with China, China's an important trade partner, They can do all that. They don't want to. And so what they're trying to do is pretend as if they want to separate the issues, but they don't, because if they did, they would just do it. And so I find that very just, whatever.
Oh yeah, no, it's an attempt to have your cake and eat it too. We saw essentially Hugo Boss try the same thing, and they got caught doing that. And this is a really difficult situation. I mean, some experts have been talking about it, sort of trying to like have your leg in two different boats, and the boats are both separating, and somebody's going to end up falling in the water. And that's the problem. At some point, if the CCP really puts these businesses to the test and says, where do you stand on these issues, which seems to be happening now or getting close to that day of reckoning, what are they going to say? And will there be ramifications for it? There may not be. There may not be ramifications for it in a political sense here in the United States. There may not be laws or policies that change, but will those stances affect their businesses in the Western world? That's a big question. And if money talks, that could be a problem if they try to take the position that the CCP wants them on.
Yeah, and so it's quite simple. We say just about every podcast, we're not calling for a Cold War. We're not calling for decoupling. We want to call out these things that we disagree with. We want to have discussion. We do it every podcast. So if Boeing wants to do that, they can do it. They don't want to do it. And so that's, to me, that's the hypocrisy that gets the blood boiling, because first off, Boeing gets all kinds of government money from the U.S. government. Second off, they make planes that crash. So let's talk about that. Third off, you want to talk about China. So like we can go through that. We can really talk about this Boeing if you want to. It's kind of like Mark Cuban coming out saying, well, I focus on domestic issues. I don't worry about international stuff. And so to me, it's very soft. You sound like you're taking a hardline stance, but you're really a coward. And to me, that's just, I would respect them if they came out and said, listen, the Uyghur stuff's terrible. We're not involved with that, though. But that's like our business isn't tied there. And we think China's an important trade partner. We're going to do business with China. I would be like, yes, agreed 100%. I'm not calling for decoupling. You aren't either. But that's not what they're saying. And to me, that's just this corporate Fortune 500. We're trying to placate both sides, and they're going to get burned. And that's what's going to happen. They're going to get burned at some point. And then what?
Well, once again, I mean, there is a case where, strength in numbers works. All you have to do is get the French government and the U.S. government to say, hey, we're going to back Boeing and Airbus to take the same position, right? Now, what's that?
We do back them.
No, but to take the same position, and we want each to essentially be unified here, right? Like you can't, you go out and say something, but we're going to stay back and take your business, right? Because right now, China doesn't have enough of those planes to supply what they need. They need Airbus and Boeing. So if Airbus and Boeing did take that stand together, then you could argue that the CCP would have a real day of reckoning that they would have to figure out. Like, what do they do moving forward? And that would actually be an interesting case where maybe we can get, like I'm talking about with Beijing 2022, some real constructive issues dealt with.
But here's what I'm saying. So this is in 2019 or 2018 that Boeing got $23.4 billion in contracts. This is 2017 from the U.S. government. 23.4 billion with a total revenue of 101 billion. They are getting backed. They already are. I'm not getting billions of dollars from the U.S. government. I'm not getting a dime. I'm paying them suckers, actually. And I'm not. So no, they are. So I would agree if you're talking about some business that's not tied to the U.S. government. These guys are, and they actually will get directed to sell or not to sell to the government. And so, to me, this does not work with Boeing because they are backed by the government already. They get $23 billion a year from them. Sorry, stone up or go home. That you're not getting. You're just not getting any slack from me.
Well, and by the way, Airbus is heavily subsidized by
right. So
So
that's the problem. It's like what else do you want? Yeah, one plane. So what else do you want the government to do in the case of Boeing? Because
that's actually a funny. I was reading that comment. I was like, what does that mean? And I'm like, yeah, yeah, that is probably one plane. The way government spends money. But yeah, I mean, it's. Look, I mean, there's by the way, strength in numbers in the aerospace business when it comes to there's really only two real commercial jet manufacturers. Right. That's a pretty easy alliance to create. You know, in other businesses like the sports industry, you could argue, well, the NBA needed others and how many others need to get together and do that, or Hollywood, all the studios and all the partners around them. Like that's a lot of wrangling cats. But in aerospace, it's two. That's it. And two countries.
And they already get government subsidies. So this isn't a big leap. So, but yeah, anyways, okay. Let's see here. We've talked about.
And by the way, as a country, let's talk about the national security issue. As a country, do we really want our best technology in the aerospace business, which is Boeing, doing business with China moving forward? Or like, I don't know. Like, I mean, I get there's big business there, but maybe you could argue there's a serious national security interest also.
You could, and that's why the Boeing thing is such hypocrisy to me. It's so much, they make a killing off of tax dollars, and then they're allowed or not allowed to work with other countries based upon what our government says. If the government came out tomorrow and said you can't work with China, they would stop doing it because of their connections to it'd be like Raytheon or these other groups. They would stop doing it. And so Lockheed Martin, they're allowed to do it because of our government. And so them not taking a hardline stance is about as soft as it gets. Like that's soft. And so yes. So it's a fair question to ask, but the larger point to me is they have government support. So use it.
Let's dive a little deeper on that really quick and just sort of the bigger issue, which is the Chinese government now realizes their biggest ally in all of this is business interest, right? I mean, let's face it, capitalism and where the buck stops and starts is drives everything, right? So they said, screw the government, like it's a bipartisan support to get tough on China. So let's just go after business interests, business lobbies, and business narrative. And I think what's interesting is that that's making real headway. I mean, if you look at what Wall Street is doing to get more and more integrated in the Chinese economy, the fact that I continue to talk to various investors that are picking my brain about where they can put money in the China market. And I'm just like, why? Don't, we got to stop sort of feeding that beast. Like, let's reset things before we start doing that. It's fallen a little, some of it's fallen on deaf ears, and it gets a little depressing at times, but you got to keep pushing the way. And I think, the longer we do this, it's going to be a game of attrition, and we're going to get this done, but we just do need to get through it fast. I mean, this China 2025 plan, as once again, to bring up his name again, Matt Pottinger, he says, once we get there, the leverage is gone, because they're going to be really, really well self-reliant and not as dependent on our supply chain and various other issues that they need right now.
So let me push back on that a little bit. Do you think by 2025 they'll be able to self-feed their country?
I don't think self-feeding is I don't think that's even possible, right? They just don't have enough of the arable land, but I think they are creating a lot of inroads to all kinds of different countries around the world that are much more open to continuing trade or growing trade with them. So yes, I know we have the soybean issue and all the other kind of stuff, but perhaps they can do it without the United States and without some of our key allies.
Yeah, I think when you look at the food issue, it's when we're concerned about the balance shifting. It comes back to the food issue for me on some level, because they are going to be dependent for our lifetime, if not longer, on importing food. And so if you can get that from the U.S. and a few of its allies, okay, great. But if you have to spread it out over a bunch of emerging markets, well, the one thing we know about emerging markets is they're not stable. Like, their economies aren't stable, their crops aren't stable. So I really think that the food angle is something to watch, because if you're getting it from emerging market X, well, that might not be very stable from year to year. And so you have to go back to the U.S. You have to go back somewhere else. So I'm not entirely convinced that they will be by 2025 as strong as they might, because they're going to be dependent on feeding their people. As long as you're dependent on feeding your people, you're in trouble.
Well, and then there's also the moral argument involved with that part of trade too. I mean, and we constantly remind anybody that's listening, and I do it all the time publicly, is like, our issue is not with the Chinese people. Yeah. It's with the Chinese government. And I'm okay with saying, hey, no more Boeing or Airbus going in there, because that's not a life or death situation for the Chinese people. If there's a pressure point on food supply that's causing malnourishment or starvation, I think that's where to be American is not justified in a trade war.
Well, that's why we should have sanctions on countries and tariffs and all that other stuff we talked about in the Middle East last time. But we'll say that for another day. I know what you're saying, and I think there is
Wait, so did you just call? So there's the hypocrisy issue, right? Which we're seeing with Iran, and I don't know if Yemen's something that we're doing. I don't know the Middle East well enough, but yes, there's a hypocrisy issue for sure.
Right. So, well, if you go back to I always point out when we invaded Iraq the second time, we found all these stockpiles of rice and food that the UN deal was supposed to, oil for food, and it didn't work. And so a lot of these humanitarian issues, while I agree with your stance, I think we don't really apply that logic very broadly to our foreign policy. And so, in Cuba, Fidel Castro has ate like a king for years, and people starve because of our policies. And so if we talk about supplying food to people, and that is something we want to encourage, which I wholeheartedly agree, let's actually do that. And there's a lot of nations that we're not doing that with. As far as Yemen goes, we were supporting the Saudis to bomb the Houthis in Yemen, and we had some troops there from time to time. So I don't know what.
One thing I wanted to bring up, and I've been thinking about an op-ed around it, but maybe it's a little out of my lane. But because you brought up Cuba, and people have been talking about how, we're trying to influence China to become more like us, et cetera, but we couldn't even do it with a small island nation 90 miles from our shores, right? Like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't really even think about that, but that's so true. The Taiwan thing, which, we talk about a lot. I'm wondering, like, look at how they took over Hong Kong, right? Mm-hmm. They did a lot of stuff up on the border, like a lot of military exercises, threatening things, barking. No, they never crossed the border, right? And then I look at Taiwan, and I'm wondering, I wonder if they feel like they can sort of do the same really subtle takeover of Taiwan that they did with Hong Kong. It just, for some reason, I was thinking about that in my head the other day. And I get the fact there's a million different Pentagon experts that have game played this a million times, but it's sort of interesting because, like, they took over Hong Kong without any military force whatsoever, really. I mean, I think they had the PAP maybe in there, People's Armed Police, that were helping the Hong Kong police with some of the protests, but there was never a tank that rolled in. There was never an a jet that flew over and shot something. It's very interesting, right?
Well, but I guess the difference would be is that they were locking people up in Hong Kong, and they were rigging the election. They were doing other stuff that they can't do in Taiwan, I would suspect, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, they're obviously trying to do information warfare in certain respects, but Taiwan has been super guarded in regards to who controls their, broadcast networks and their radio and all that kind of stuff, and really trying to shelter the people. So yes, it's a different dynamic. But I don't know, the Taiwan thing, there's been a lot of articles about how people are getting very nervous about what's going to happen there. You and I polled each other about the percent chance that something happens before Beijing. I think you were 1% and I said 20%. But it's fascinating to watch. And the rhetoric now is just so crazy between our country and theirs, and then Taiwan and various other European nations, and then the Australia stuff. It's hard not to think that there's something going on that may be more of a plan than we expect, but I just don't want to be tinfoil hat and be all alarmist either.
Well, the other thing, if you look back last year, so China was doing something with Australia, with India, Hong Kong, obviously the COVID stuff, Taiwan, the World Health Organization. They were like moving all of these parts around, and they've really kind of calmed that down. It's not, I mean, they're still doing stuff, obviously, but it's not like it was in 2020. So I'm wondering if we're kind of looking for the next thing, because we came off a year where they were geopolitically all over the place. Now they're doing a deal with Iran. They're not attacking Iran or border skirmishing. They're not doing anything like that. They're kind of working with them. They're sending vaccines to Africa. They've almost kind of done this kind of flip of geopolitical policies on some regard. And it felt like last year they looked at what was going on and everyone was distracted. So they kind of made these moves, and now everyone's focused back in. And so they're back to, hey, we're good people. We're doing this. We're doing that. We're going to take care of people here. And they're still putting pressure on Taiwan. I know, but it's not like it was last year. That's at least my take on it. Maybe I'm being optimistic.
I mean, the Philippines situation is just over the last couple of weeks, right? And then India's border skirmishes were this year, right? I mean, that was not that long ago. And
did they happen in January? Because the big one was like last summer, where they had the rock fight and all that stuff.
Well, there was a lot of stuff going on in the wintertime there too. Because I mean, I remember seeing the photos of like all the snow in the mountains and stuff too. So I don't know. I mean, they did back out. They did pull a camp out of that riverbed, so maybe there was some sort of a truce. And then on top of it, I mean, the Australian thing seems to get ramped up even more so. The UK is super ramped up. There's a lot of issues right now. But I can see that.
That's when it started. May 5th. God, it's almost a year now.
Wait, when the people all fell off the cliff over there?
Yeah, that was May 5th of last year.
God, that's crazy.
I thought it was like late summer, May 5th. Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, because they built up a military camp, and then I think they tore it down not that long ago. So it's interesting. Well, anyway, so there. I mean, look, and then on top of it, some of the other things that I was just going to bring up that goes into the narrative. One of them was Chicago Council Org came out with this American public sentiment towards China poll, which I thought was a little daunting. It looked as if Americans were a little up in the air about how they felt about China in certain ways. It wasn't quite as drastic as the Pew Research poll that came out, I think, maybe 6 weeks ago. And I'm just wondering if some of the seepage of, remember Chinese Communist Party and the massive sort of narrative players in that Ministry of Propaganda are on platforms like Twitter, like Facebook, like YouTube, et cetera. And I'm just wondering if they're pounding away at sort of this China narrative is seeping into the American public and making it calm down a bit about what this challenge and threat is. Another thing that I was going to bring up was just this article about in Shanghai, they're talking about taking away some of the tax benefits and tax deductions and allowed of various expats that are working there with global companies that are based in Shanghai. That's going to be interesting to see if China starts pushing out some of those companies from its shores because of these tax advantages that disappear. And then the other thing that, you and I were going to maybe mention in passing is just this COVID WHO thing that just continues to stay in the news cycle, even though I think we all know, it started in China, how it did, I guess we probably will never know. Like you said, whatever, if it wasn't a lab, it's probably been burned down and covered up with a flower bed or something like that. So it's almost like, why do we even talk about it anymore? Let's move on and start thinking about how we're going to address the next pandemic, which will probably come from China just because they're the most populated country on earth.
Yeah. And I just want to point out on the bot stuff, there's a story out there about Bezos, hiring bots to kind of keep the Amazon reputation up. And if Bezos is doing that, I had actually someone the other day comment on something. I can't remember what it was. And the comment was, the U.S. is a robber. And, it was just, they had like one follower, but it was just very much a bot response. And I was like, okay, whatever. Went about my business. But, if Jeff Bezos, Amazon, is trying to make sure that Amazon's image in the U.S. looks good, whatever you think of Amazon, I'm not taking a side here. If he's doing that, the CCP and everyone else and their mama who has money is doing that as well. So I think we got to realize that when you get on social media, these outrageous anonymous accounts and they're just flame throwing everything, probably a larger percentage that we want to acknowledge are bots. even if they agree or disagree with this, they're probably bots, and so it's kind of hard to really gauge. I don't engage personally with anonymous accounts very often, unless I'm kind of just trolling them back because I don't know, is this a serious person or not? So I like to engage with real people, have real conversations. But all social media needs to be. We need to realize that even if you have 1,000 people liking your stuff, and it's all anonymous accounts, it could be 1,000 bots that are just kind of trained to support your stuff. And anyways, so I thought that was interesting that Bezos was even doing that.
Yeah, it'd be sort of sad to think that you're a pretty popular person and you find out everyone you thought was a friend of yours is actually just some bot. Oh man. Anyway, I'm going to be. My kids are on spring break next week, so I'm off Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Maybe you and I can try to get one going on Friday. If for some reason shit really hits the fan between the U.S. and China, maybe you and I can do something remotely. I don't know. I think maybe people would love to have a rest from hearing our voices talk about China for a few days. So anyway, I appreciate everybody tuning in. It's been a lot of fun talking up all this stuff that seems to be crescendoing by the day. It's always fun to have an exchange with Ryan and the fact that he comes from a really different sort of vantage point than I do. And I think we both see very eye to eye on how to, at least foster dialogue and discussion and something that hopefully is relatively constructive to deal with this very big challenge facing all Americans.
Agreed 100%. And I'll just throw this out there. I had a listener reach out and called about something I said in the podcast, and we had a good 30-minute call. We're just kind of going back over what I said versus what he thought was right. And it took about 30 minutes to kind of tease out exactly what we were saying, why we thought what we thought. Maybe we were talking past each other. And I think that's the thing that I'm often reminded when you say something I disagree with or vice versa, or I hear something is that, this is a 35-minute show we try to go for. These conversations, they evolve, they move, they change, you learn new information. And that's part of what we're trying to foster here. It's not that, as you started off with, it's not that we're giving all of the policy moving forward. It's we're trying to have a conversation about this very complex subject on a regular basis. And so 3 months from now, you might come back and there's something that we've said that's different. Well, that's because we're trying to listen and trying to learn. And that's what we're trying to foster. So anyways, reach out. Would love to talk to the listeners at the Dragon Theater on Twitter, at Ryan Ray Sr. on Twitter. If you missed any of the show, go download the podcast where you can get it on iTunes, Spotify. Leave us a 5-star review because it's spring break next week. And we would love nothing more than to read those on our week off. Mr. Fenton, we'll be back, I guess, maybe next week, if not the week after for sure.
Yeah, have a great weekend, everyone, and thanks for tuning in as always.